Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, the 7th webinar in our webinar series of the RECLAIM project. We're still perhaps a minute away from starting, so we'll just wait till it goes half past. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Thomas Kjeldsen. I'm a lecturer at the University of Bath, and I have the privilege of chairing today's interesting webinar of the RECLAIM network. So the RECLAIM network is a UK research and innovation funded scientific network focusing on reclaiming forgotten cities and how to turn cities from vulnerable spaces into healthy places for people. It's a collaborative effort. It's led by University of Surrey under Professor Kumar, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, with participation from Universities of Warwick, Bath, Bangor, and the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And in addition, we have a big membership. We have more than 350 members now from academia, local governments, and businesses, all coming together, all contributing and benefiting from the network in different ways. As part of the network, we have committed to organizing webinars like the one today. We've planned to conduct 18 webinars running until March 2024. They run every month, and the format is they consist of 2 speakers who both get 20 minutes, and then there's question and answers. And we've had some really good and interesting and well-attended webinars, and I'm sure today will be no different from those. If you're interested in becoming a speaker, so we have a fairly full program, but there's still spaces. So if you're interested and feel you have something to say or would like to share with the wider community, we'll invite you to become a speaker at our webinars, and you can use the barcode below or go to our website. The details of that will come up at the end. So it's a real pleasure today to introduce our 2 speakers. Professor Paul Monks, who's Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and Professor Chris Rogers, who's Director of the Centre for Infrastructure and Urban Systems at the University of Birmingham. The order of proceedings is that Chris has agreed to start, so he'll start the presentation. I'll just to introduce Chris. Says that in his quest to make effective interventions in our city's infrastructure systems to support the move to more sustainable, resilient and livable futures, Chris has spent more than 20 years developing a suite of methodologies that enable decision makers to take more informed decisions in this space. These include the use of extreme yet plausible future scenarios, city performance assessment, and the creation of novel business models. He's a member of the lead expert group of the Foresight Futures of Cities project, and he's a founding member of the UK Collaboratorium for Research on Infrastructure and Cities, which is known as UCRIC. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Rogers, and no further ado, Chris, over to you.
Right, thank you. So now I need to share my screen. Which I can see. So you should be able to see my screen, is this right?
Yes, we can, Chris.
Okay. Yes, working well.
Okay, good. Yes, I want to talk to you today about pervasive green infrastructure corridors as routes to, well, a more civilized life, perhaps. More sustainable, resilient and livable cities is the title. And this slide shows the logos of some of the projects that I've led that have contributed to this suite of methodologies I'm going to be talking about, even to the extent of a current program grant, of which I'm the deputy PI, looking at pipebots, which are swarms of miniature robots to go into pipelines to assess their condition, Because if we understand the condition of pipelines, we could use trenchless technologies in order to repair and maintain them and avoid digging trenches in roads and then disrupting our urban mobility systems or the urban metabolism. All of these things link together in a certain way, and I hope to demonstrate that. So if I were now to talk about cities, and if I were then to cast my mind back several centuries or even millennia, then settlements would come together if we had a place to trade, particularly a place to trade in relation to food, a place of safety, source of clean water. We could create a settlement. What we now want of our places, though, is really far more than any one slide could put up. I mean, here is some of the things that we want and demand of our cities. I'm a civil engineer, so what I do is I support civilized life. That's my role in life. So what I do is I provide the systems to supply stuff, remove stuff, facilitate the movement of people and stuff, if you wish. So we need infrastructure systems, and those infrastructure systems necessarily need to be designed to be sustainable, resilient, livable, smart, adaptable. All of those things must come to play. The far future is important because what we create as civil engineers typically lasts a very long time, decades or maybe even centuries. So if I took that slide and just highlighted a few of the elements of it, then that's very much looking at how people relate to cities and designing for people, put people at the heart of the city. Well, that's fine. I would design according to that, but I could highlight a different set of words on that slide to put productivity at the heart of the city. So we either need infrastructure systems to support people and communities and society, or support productivity, or rather, and support productivity. So we're now looking to meet a whole raft of needs in the way we create our systems. And I talk about these terms, and of course I need to define them, and resilience then being continuing to function in the face of contextual change, no matter what that contextual change is or how rapid it is, for that matter. Sustainability, well, we have a number of definitions. Livability, putting people and the planet at the heart of everything. So what I'm going to do is show some slides. I'm not going to go over all of the detail in them. The slides are there to be looked at whenever you want. Smart, incidentally, is only truly smart if it delivers on the above. It's not about doing things swifter or cheaper, but just retaining the status quo. So if I'm going to enable change to happen in cities, the first thing I need to do is to compile a rigorous evidence base. And that's what researchers do. I mean, we create, on behalf of the government, a strong evidence base on which to base decisions. Once we have that evidence base, we can draw on it to make a case for change, a case for making things run better, if you wish. The case for change would need to be comprehensive and accessible and transparent, so that it is a strong, compelling case for change, if you wish. But alongside that, we have to create the design options that would enable that change to happen. And for each of the design options, there will be an associated business model. Then I want to come on to what that is. But essentially what we do is we analyze the design options and business models to understand all of the positive and all the negative outcomes, so that we're making an informed decision. But if I'm now talking business models, what value do we place on sustainability? What value on resilience? What value on livability for an investment in a something or other? Because that's, of course, is value in the future. So how do we balance value today against value in the future? And then if we look at today, there are an awful lot of compelling investment cases for, well, just look at the news. But in order to do our design appropriately and create our business models appropriately, we need to understand all of the forms of governance that can influence whether the business models deliver what they should, and the designs deliver what they should, for that matter. And if the forms of governance get in the way, then we might need to alter them or engineer them so that they are synergistic. And when I talk of forms of governance, there's all the formal forms of governance we know and love, legislation, regulation, taxation, codes and standards, the levers of government that shape the way things are done. But then there are the informal systems of governance, the individual and societal attitudes and behaviors that we need to take account of. Societal norms, very powerful. Social acceptability. Practice norms, also very powerful. If you want to change a system, change practices, then there can be considerable resistance. And then avoidance of risk. So what I want to do is outline the approaches that I would now take following that program of research. And the very first point is to make sure that all of those people who should be part of the conversation are part of the conversation and they have an equal voice. So here I'm looking at making sure that we've got this very broad, multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral group. If we're now looking at an intervention in our system of systems that make up our cities. If you like, all the relevant disciplines, all the communities of interest, in fact, all of the departments of government come into play, so that we're avoiding the silos. And then we need to understand the aspirations of all of those stakeholders. And if you like, top down from the city and the way it is operated, and bottom up from the citizens. And we need to understand the context, the unique context in which any particular place exists. And so we need to know something about the past and the present. Quite clearly, we're only going to make change if we think that the system is not working in the way it ought. So we need to define fully the problems before we start. And that's sort of blindingly obvious, if you wish. We also need to understand how the current system is performing. So the baseline performance of the city, how livable is it, how sustainable, how resilient, and so on. How is it working? In order to aid this, we need to map our system of interest. And so I'm going to come on to talk about green infrastructure corridors. I could map that system of interest in relation to all of the other infrastructure and urban systems to establish the dependencies and interdependencies with those other systems. And only once I've done that can the engineer get to do what he or she does, which is solve problems. The root of the word engineer is ingenuity. It's what we do. We solve problems. And that will yield a number of design options for consideration as part of our solution. And we can understand well enough, I think, how those design solutions would work today, because we can look around. We understand how today's world works. So we can assess using a number of different techniques whether our intervention is going to have a suite of impacts that are overall positive or negative or whatever. We can understand all of the impacts today. But of course, we also need to do a futures analysis. And again, I've got a methodology that was developed in a program of research to look at extreme yet plausible futures so that we understand whether what we're putting in today is likely to be vulnerable to societal change, political change, contextual change. And once we've done that, we can then advance this suite of business models, alternative business models associated with the design options with an understanding of sustainability and resilience embedded to identify all of the consequences of the intervention, positive consequences and negative consequences. And only when we've done that can we then confidently start to make the case for change. That has to be compelling and based upon all of the evidence above. The design options, the business models, and the dimensions of governance. All of those need to be taken into consideration. And those dimensions of governance not only relate to our intervention itself, but also the context in which the intervention is being carried out. And as I say, if we need to change them, then we should. But only at that point can we then influence policy in one of two ways. We can either influence policy to shape it on the basis of our findings, or to make the case for the intervention to policymakers. Then we need, at the same time, to influence practice and then influence and inform the public. Inform the public so they understand the problems that we're addressing, but also appreciate what we're doing on their behalf in terms of the solutions put forward. But if we then meet stakeholder aspirations, we know that what we're going to be doing is addressing the informal forms of governance. And if we go further and co-create the solutions with those stakeholders, then we will get far more assured buy-in of our solutions, and therefore they are more likely to work and deliver their intended outcomes. So I talked about green infrastructure corridors, and that's a solution, but the solution didn't appear first. What appeared first was some work I did when I was on the Foresight Future of Cities project. So this ran from 2013 to 2015. And at that time, I was leading a program grant called Livable Cities. And we teamed up and we created what we call the aspirational futures methodology, where we went to both Bristol and to Birmingham. In Bristol, we had 12 people representing the city, and we simply asked them for their aspirations for their city. And we got a whole bunch of Post-it notes. And what we did was we clustered those Post-it notes, and then we went through a sequence of activities. And here are some of Bristol's aspirations. I mentioned this idea of a system map. And so what we did was created a system map for a green infrastructure corridor. And this is just the first layer of that system map, showing how it is either dependent or interdependent with a whole raft of other features of our infrastructure and urban systems. And what you can do with this system map is, well, there are a number of things, and they're all really rather powerful. And the first idea is you can then identify all of the stakeholders who should be part of the conversation. We can obviously look at the impacts of our system change on those other systems, and look at the impacts of those system interdependencies on the design options or the business models or whatever. We can also understand the systems of governance that need to be recognized as we take our designs forward. But you can also look at the system map from different perspectives, different stakeholder perspectives. And so any one stakeholder can look at this and say, well, those are important to me. These ones are of lesser importance or no importance. And so if that system is put into place, how will it affect my world, if you wish? We can analyze it against any number of the national or international priorities. We can look at it in terms of zero carbon. We can look at it in terms of simple economic return on investment. So an investment is put in, what is the payback? That's a very narrow view to take, though, because we've got benefits in terms of resilience or sustainability or social benefits, environmental benefits, of course, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. We can analyze it in all sorts of ways. And of course, we can analyze it in terms of any specific design option. So each of the design options can be filtered through. So this is a very powerful way of doing it. Just to give you an example of the Sustainable Development Goal analysis. So sustainable communities and cities, SDG 11. And so all I've done is I've listed out some of those targets or indicators that relate to SDG 11. And they're listed here with different colors just to separate them. There's no difference in the color. But if I then looked at pervasive green infrastructure corridors, what I can do is look at how I impact positively or negatively on a number of those different elements. And the red highlights show where the impacts lie. And those are potential for improvement. So the method that I'm going to talk through now very briefly is very simple. It's effectively to test the compliance of an action being taken today, a system intervention, putting pervasive green infrastructure corridors into the city, and aligning it with both the cities and the citizens' aspirations, the top down and bottom up, that complete set of aspirations, for which I need to understand the intended benefits of the intervention and the necessary conditions for those benefits to be delivered. And then I go through, in my case, 3 extreme futures, and I won't explain that, but of course it's in the paper that underpins all of this. So diagrammatically, this is the way to carry out that simple process. We look at the aspirations, we identify all the intended benefits, And then we look at whether the necessary conditions are in place. So the starting point is to identify all of the intended benefits. And some of these are blindingly obvious. But if I were to lock you in a room for half an hour, I'm sure you could come up with a list that is several times longer than this of the benefits that you think green infrastructure corridors could bring. I mean, I've written them out here so that they're slightly easier to read. But they do things that we would naturally expect. But if I go back to my system map, I can be far more rigorous in identifying the benefits that could be brought to bear as a result of interconnected green infrastructure corridors. And so here we have our starting point of what it is we could achieve. But now we can go slightly deeper. So if I'm looking at reducing the pressure on the NHS, for example, as one of my outcomes, then I can look at the impacts on health and well-being as a result of putting this intervention into place. So the analysis can go much deeper with different lenses, as I've said. Then I need to ensure that the necessary conditions are in place for those benefits to be delivered. And again, this flows from above, and many of these are blindingly obvious. So the green infrastructure corridors must be in the right places. Well, of course, and they must be interconnected and must be designed in relation to the other systems of mobility, and they must feel safe to use, and so on and so on. So there's a whole raft of necessary conditions that must be in place. And then we have to question whether they meet the collective aspirations. So do the multiple intended benefits meet the citizens' aspirations bottom up, cities' aspirations top down? Are the necessary conditions in alignment with those aspirations? And what was interesting is when we ran through the green infrastructure corridor analysis subsequently, we found that they met, well, quite naturally, the environmental aspirations really very strongly. So 15 of the 31 environmental aspirations that were listed on the post-it notes were strongly impacted by green infrastructure corridors. The 13 of the 42 social aspirations were likewise positively impacted. But interestingly, 8 of the 35 economic aspirations were impacted. And in fact, I've turned this around because when we went through that process of looking at the aspirations and how cities might change, it was the green infrastructure corridors that emerged as a potential solution. And then we ran it through this process. So do they address the current demographic urbanization challenges that we face? Well, green infrastructure corridors lower all emissions, support low carbon initiatives, almost by definition, if you wish. So it's again, it's an obvious outcome. Improving health and well-being. Again, we sort of know that, but did we design it specifically to reduce pressure on the NHS? It's a question that can be hanging, but of course it brings those benefits. It also reduces the cost of travel and addresses inequalities. So the levelling up agenda. The future of mobility. So now can we look at other ways to improve those green infrastructure corridors? A smart system of e-bikes seamlessly linked with public transport, for example, would then take away some of the issues of uncertainty of use. And if we now start to plan this with the communities to deliver whatever features they want, access to facilities, for example, links to park and ride, bigger city-wide systems, mitigating flood risk, and so on and so on and so on. And I could go on for a long time. So the answer is yes. They do, I would argue, deliver on those wider systems. So a process for better system interventions, well, first of all, we need that evidence base. So and that's what our research community provides. And we can draw on that to make a case for change. We can create design options tailored obviously to the cities and the citizens' aspirations and to the place itself, because the context is all important as to whether the design options work. We can assemble the alternative business models for each of those design options, capturing a portfolio of benefits, if you wish. All of the forms of value against the costs, set against the costs or the adverse consequences is one way to look at it. Or, if you wish, all the positive outcomes set against all the negative outcomes of a system intervention. And then we can identify and, if necessary, engineer all of the forms of governance to ensure that the business models work, deliver their intended outcomes both now and into the far future. So this both delivers greater value from our system intervention and de-risks the intervention, because we've made all the likely outcomes transparent. So that is where this provides its ultimate value, if you wish, this sequence of processes. Here are three of the papers that underpin this particular presentation, and we've just on the point of publishing our little book of theory of change for infrastructure and cities. This comes out of the UK Collaboratorium for Research on Infrastructure and Cities, but it wraps up all of those methodologies that I've just been talking about. And this is the Collaboratorium illustrated in terms of its UK centres. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing at that point.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Just remind everyone, if you have questions for Chris or for Paul, who's going to give the next presentation, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom. So please put your questions there, and we'll take some of those towards the end. So it's a great pleasure that I introduce our next speaker, who's Professor Paul Monks. So Paul is a Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, where he delivers independent and impartial scientific advice to ministers and policymakers across the department's portfolio in order to support delivery of a robust evidence base to underpin policy decisions. Prior to joining the Department of Government, Paul was the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Head of College of Science and Engineering at the University of Leicester, where he remains a professor in atmospheric chemistry and Earth observation science. So thank you for agreeing to give this talk, Paul. Over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. Can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Yes, all good.
Super. So thank you very much to Chris. Strangely, Chris and I have not colluded, but I'm about to say probably exactly the same that he's just said, but from a slightly different point of view. I'm going to zoom all the way out to the macro problem, if you will, of net zero, but probably arrive at the very same conclusion that Chris did from his short talk. So I'm going to talk about green-blue infrastructure and net zero very quickly. For those of you that don't know what net zero is the commitment put down in legislation in 2019, well, originally in 2008 and then amended in 2019, to have a 100% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels. So that's what net zero is. So by 2050, we'll have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions 100% compared to 1990 levels. We do that as part of the Climate Change Act. In the Climate Change Act, we do a series of carbon budgets. In June 2021, we set carbon budget 6, and they are five-year budgets that allow that. Many of you will be aware of the COP process as part of this. We use these actual carbon budgets to set our what's called nationally determined contribution, which we set in COP26 in Glasgow last year. The 6th carbon budget, which is the last one, which is the mid-2030s, has committed us to a 78% reduction in emissions compared to 1990 levels by the mid-30s there, 2035. And in a way, here's where the challenge on the green infrastructure starts to come in. We're going to have to do a lot of things to reach that. On the right-hand side of this figure, what you can see is the carbon budgets and the trajectories. And in order to set that, you're going to have low carbon energy, more of that, low carbon solutions, less carbon intensity, and also transforming agriculture and greenhouse gas removals. And I'll get back to that point in a second of where that then drives us towards green infrastructure. It's worth just at the top level thinking again about how you abate the greenhouse gases of a net zero. And this is a figure taken from the Climate Change Committee, who are the committee tasked with holding government to account around its climate change goals. And this is just one of the pathways that they published in one of their reports. And they make the point that there are different ways you can do it. What we tend to forget, and actually what we're seeing, of course, through the current energy challenges, is that actually reducing demand, 68% of people now have reduced their energy demand over this current period of time. You can improve efficiency in the way that you use energy in all its form. You can look at low carbon solutions, electrification, hydrogen, CCS, and the like. You can also think about land use and GGR, greenhouse gas recovery. And I think that's where we'll begin to think a little bit about that intersection with the green infrastructure piece. It's worth kind of just thinking on the next slide about the scale of the challenge, though. This is the current emissions by sectors, if you will, transport, industry, power, etc. And really, to achieve net zero by 2050, we are going to require that economy-wide transformation. But I think it's worth just kind of pausing on the land use, natural resources bit, because in a way, that's where the intersection comes. We know that, for example, we're going to have to be able to store more carbon. So actually we're going to need to have 3 times more woodland today. We're going to actually need to increase the amount of biomass as part of that, and that's biomass either that we grow ourselves or that we import as well as using things in the greenhouse gas removal, such as bioenergy with CCS, which is called BECCS, direct air capture, and a number of other areas which kind of begin to impinge in green infrastructure. Probably not the way that you're thinking about it, because I'm talking about growing it to burn it mostly, which is not probably the way that you guys think about it. But I kind of want to put that idea that actually the greening is a good thing in a net zero world. There are multiple benefits, and as Chris made the point in his last talk quite clearly, it's gaining those multiple benefits from a greening or green infrastructure type way. The way that we achieve net zero, we have a strategy, which is the net zero strategy, which we put out in October 2021, and there's a series of other sub-strategies that brought together, which I won't go through. So this is kind of where Chris and I really do intersect on this. You cannot achieve net zero if you do not undertake a systems approach to doing that. And it's this systems thinking and systems approaches which are very much at the heart of the way that you will deliver net zero. So I've just drawn the energy transition here as a system map. Chris drew the green infrastructure system map. What you can see down the left-hand side there are the major energy sources: electricity, gas, oil and petroleum. On the right-hand side, those major sectors again, including recognizing the role of green infrastructure again, in this slide, in the sense of where it sits in that land and water. But this is not a systems problem. So this is the energy system. This is a systems problem, because actually, in order to make that change, you've got to have the link to consumer behavior and behavior change as part of that. This is not a technocratic view of the way that we're going to achieve net zero. It is people that change, and people that change habits as well. And the CCC have said, over 80% of the measures that we're going to need to implement to meet net zero are going to have combinations of technology and people. People use technology, technology does not use itself. And then the second point is, so we've got a system of systems problem. There's finance in this. This takes money to make these sort of transitions. We often call it the green premium, but actually that intersects with the UK financial systems and funding. So we've got a system of systems problem. But actually, we're not doing this on our own. It's a global problem. So we've got the global energy transition, and we've got the global economic transition. So we have a system of systems problem. So we have, as Chris said, we have a systems problem here. And that's really, really important to understand, where when you do the sort of analyses that we're talking about, that you're trying to do that in an absolutely systems type framework. Because if not, you end up with a law of unintended consequences. So, in the last net zero pathway that we looked at, as I said, 44% of emission savings are going to require people to make green choices as part of that. Economic and social, environmental and social planning is a key element of that in the way that we look at that. So when we're talking about green infrastructure or blue infrastructure as well, we've got to put the behavioural angle and the want and the user demand for that as well. So just kind of moving on a little bit, I think it would be wrong though, and you could accuse somebody like I work and provide scientific advice to the Department of Energy, if you will, that we're very mitigation focused in this. It's all about climate mitigation. Well, no, it isn't, absolutely not. As came out of COP27 quite clearly, we're going to need to do adapt and mitigate at the same sort of time. Climate is going to change. We'll be very lucky not to exceed 1.5 degrees. Climate warning. So we really got to put that adaptation and mitigation piece together like that jigsaw. And interesting, when you look at the overlapping areas here between the very sort of mitigation view I've just given you and the very adaptation view is a green infrastructure and blue infrastructure sits at that key intersection between adaptation and mitigation when it comes to climate change. So it's an important area in order to drive that intersection between adaptation and mitigation. It's probably the greatest scientific challenge that we face. The greatest challenge that we face is to decarbonize our economies, and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. For me, we've got to make that the science of that. We've got to understand the sustainability of the solutions that we're putting forward. We've got to look at the resilience of the solutions, and I think that's recognizing, I think as Chris kind of said in his talk, there's more than one pathway to green infrastructure. There's more than one pathway to net zero. We've got to make sure those pathways are resilient in the way that we do it. I think you've also got to make it real to people. And for me, the next thing about net zero is to make it measurable. So for me, net zero has to be sustainable, resilient, and measurable. They're the three big things that we've got to think about. Measurable makes it real. Resilient recognizes we're going to different pathways, and sustainability recognizes that we need to think about all the different intersections in that. So I just want to give, in the last sort of 5 or 6 minutes of my talk, a sort of example of that intersectionality in the way that you drive systems thinking, from the intersection really between air quality, climate, and net zero, and really the way that drives that. And you say, well, what? He was tenuous in the first half of the talk about green infrastructure. Why is this? Well, actually, I'm going to talk about the role of trees, as that green infrastructure. And some work that I did was I did myself. I worked with a whole bunch of people when I was chair of the air quality expert group in DEFRA, looking at the impacts of vegetation on urban air pollution. And for those of you not familiar with the role of trees in air pollution, at least, they have two roles. They're essentially aerodynamic. They move air as it flows across the surface. And the second thing they can do is you can lose air pollutants which are physically lost to the surface of a tree. So they have two kind of properties. They can trap versus disperse aerodynamically, or you can deposit to the surface. Just to bring that into consideration, here's a street in Marylebone in London. We're looking at air pollutant now, small particles. And on the top left-hand corner, you can see the concentrations emitted in a street without any trees. And then actually you can see how massively different that is when you put trees on that. And actually what you can see in the way that we model this, and this is just a model, and debate all the parameters in there if anybody's really interested around that. But what we can see is the aerodynamic loss, the way that trees actually change the way that the air flows over a city, or in this case a street, is much bigger than the deposition. And actually it's a very interesting, which I'll get to in a minute, kind of paradigm that comes out of this sort of thinking. So green infrastructure, you can demonstrate has a benefit to air quality. You could then take that up to the city scale, and we created a model for the mega city of Leicester, looking at the way that if you flow the air across that, how much was the aerodynamics changed, how much did you lose by trees, and also we added the grass into that as well as another surface in there, and we did it at 2 wind speeds, 1 meter per second where it's relatively still, and the average wind speed in the UK, which is 4.6 meters per second. And you can clearly see that the aerodynamic loss again is much bigger than that. Of course, as the wind drops, you get more trapping. What we actually found is if you're interested in green infrastructure in a city and the way that you want to change the air pollution, actually planting trees in the suburbs is more effective than planting them in the center of the city. Why is that? Because it increases the surface roughness of the city. And actually what you're really looking at is the net surface roughness of the city. So as you flow the air across, you're actually lifting the air pollution away from the surface. So that's a really interesting way that you could think about green infrastructure and air quality and that sort of intersection. And what it really showed in a way is that the actual, of course, if you're having aerodynamic roughness, all you're doing is you're not removing the air pollution, you're just moving it somewhere else. So as I always kind of joke, we just send it to Birmingham from Leicester, you know. And actually what these models show, and again, you can debate the parameters, that actually the loss processes are not particularly thing, and of course they're very dependent upon wind speed. And actually at the end of this report, we said, look, actually there's lots of good reasons that you want to plant trees. Overall, vegetation trees in particular are beneficial for air quality, but they're not the solution. They're not the solution at a city scale, and that led us to an important paradigm, if you will. This is classically air quality and policy, you know, and there's a very complicated statement here. You want to control emissions at source. Removing pollutions once they're diluted in the atmosphere is challenging, and you can read the rest of it on the screen. But the way we explained it to policymakers was, if you don't want milk in your coffee, don't put milk in your coffee and stir it in and then try and remove it. You know, because that's essentially the problem you're trying to solve. So don't put the air pollution there in the first place. You know, and then try and remove it. That's the coffee cup paradigm, if you will. So that's really important that you do that. But if I'm to follow through my systems thinking, you've got to think about the way that changes as climate changes, which is back to the net zero link here at the end of my talk. So we've got to think about the way that you get that interaction with net climate. Many of the air pollutants, particularly things like ozone and black carbon, are actually air quality pollutants, even methane, which only has a lifetime of about 7 years. So actually this is a classical forcing diagram, and actually you'll be familiar with CO2 and methane, but there's also some of the air pollutants cool the atmosphere as well, so you get a trade-off between the cooling and the warming as part of that. And the Royal Society put a report together to look at the effects of net zero policies and climate change and air quality. And what they said is there's going to be 3 things here when you talk about air quality policy and net zero. There will be areas where you do get clear benefits, i.e. electrification. You drive out the emissions from cars. There will be important mitigation strategies you have to put in place, and there will be some areas where you do not have any at all. And they put this together, a diagram, which is a diagram styled after a guy called Martin Williams, who put the first diagram together. And what he showed is you've got to think in the systems way of areas where you get the benefit between air quality and climate change. But he also said, when he originally put this diagram together, the way that you travel across this diagram is not always the top right-hand corner, where you get the win-win benefit, if you will. You might have to expect some win-lose in order to get the different sort of goals. But actually, and you say, what has this got to do with green infrastructure and net zero? Well, actually, if you look in there, carbon sequestration with low BVOC emitting tree species is there. So the recognition that actually green infrastructure has multiple benefits, as Chris said. And actually, you wouldn't plant trees on the grounds of just wanting to stop air pollution. It's not a good idea. But for all the other reasons in that system that you might want that green infrastructure, but you want to also design that green infrastructure that it doesn't make something like air pollution any worse by being a high emitter of volatile compounds that can then drive that sort of chemistry. So you've got to look for these win-win sort of spaces. You've got to think in a system way, and the way that green infrastructure green-blue infrastructure sits into that net zero world that we're trying to create. And these are the sort of net zero maps. This is a transportation map that you could begin to produce, very similar to the ones that sort of Chris showed in his talk. In a way that drives you to the final conclusion of this, we need that whole system thinking on climate. So I've just got a prettier diagram, I think, than Chris's in some senses. It's not a war, Chris, by the way. But you can now see all the different health benefits, agriculture, carbon capture, sequestration, all the tools of that and the linkages from that. So if we are to achieve net zero, we need to have that system thinking. We need to bring that together, and green infrastructure is an incredibly important part of that in the way that it fits on that. My final comment before I finish is that I've drawn all these pretty diagrams. This is not a pretty system. In a way, science underpins the house of climate and climate change building, which has intersections with the economy, society, and governance. We've talked about adaptation and mitigation. So though that system diagram makes it look simple, it's a very complicated system that we're dealing with a lot of pressures which are socioeconomic as much as they also are scientific. So hopefully that was interesting. What my conclusions are: we have a significant challenge from net zero, and that challenge is pervasive in everything that we do. You need that systems approach. That's the take-home message, not surprisingly, in this, in order to get that alongside the behavior change. And we need to recognize the benefits of green and blue infrastructure in that system type thinking and that system framework. So thank you very much indeed, and I hopefully that was interesting. And if you're interested, this is my KPI for being a CSA, as Chief Scientific Advisor, is I'm trying to get up my number of Twitter followers. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, you could feel free. Thank you very much indeed for listening today.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. Actually, thank you to both speakers. Those were really high quality talks. It's interesting to see how they both focused on complex systems, and the complexity really is that the high quality science that has to also consider the sort of socioeconomic systems and how that's a real challenge. So we'll now have a Q&A session. I'm sure there are lots of questions for both speakers. So at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Nerea Calvillo, who will chair the Q&A session. Over to you, Nerea.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you to these two speakers for these wonderful and really inspiring presentations, in part because they make so clear the complexity of the problem, but at the same time, proposing methods to deal with it and find solutions. So thank you so much. So there's 5 questions in the Q&A chat. So please, if you have any others, keep writing them down. So the first one is about measurement, actually, and an anonymous attendee asks if what are the ways of quantifying more definitively outcomes like reducing pressure on NHS or addressing inequalities to support these at all? And I would add any social issues in general, because their effects are long-lasting effects. So are there ways to measure these benefits in a significant way?
So I can start. I mean, in air quality, we have damage functions, and which look at the incremental cost benefit analysis. And actually, the way that government tends to do this, and government science tends to do this, it tends to stack up measures, look at the cost of those measures, and it has very clear ways of being able to quantify the health benefits of those. And often the trade-off is how much do you want to spend mitigating pollution versus what health benefit do you get? And actually, avoided costs, which are the most difficult to work out, are a key feature, of that. It's very easy to mitigate direct costs. I think the system has a real problem trying to work out what avoided costs are. So I've taken a measure, so I'm not going to have something. I can't just do a straight cost benefit analysis on it. What's the challenge of an avoided cost versus a mitigated cost, if you will, in that sort of system? And in climate change and net zero, that's really germane, where you really want avoided costs. You don't want to have to then mitigate it once you've got it. Chris, I don't know if you have a view.
May I ask for a clarification? Sorry, what are the avoided costs? Sorry.
So you do something that avoids you. So an avoided cost is you take a measure that avoids incurring the cost. So you put up a flood defense, so you don't get flooded. So you've avoided the cost of the damage of the flooding.
I see.
Yeah? So that's an avoided cost, rather than you've got then the cost of that. So often in health benefits is the idea that you then reduce the number of people coming in, but you've got to quantify the cost that you've avoided rather than mitigate. Yeah, I'm not explaining very clearly, but is that question of you are trying to reduce? You said, well, my health cost is currently this. I want to reduce it to something smaller, but actually you're also at the same time avoiding costs that you would have paid that would increase that cost. If that makes sense.
Exactly.
Chris, maybe you can explain the avoided cost better than I can.
Perfect, thank you.
Yes, and so I quite clearly concur with that. What I did say right at the start is that we need to have all of those people at the table who would be able to make those types of judgments, and so the trying to put a simple metric on any of this is impossible, because there are so very many different outcomes that we would then be seeking to bring. Quite often we have a starting point. So that starting point is, so how do we move towards net zero as a city? And if we were then looking at the net zero thing and we were bringing in green infrastructure corridors, then we would look at all of these other benefits that will arise. And then it's that portfolio of benefits. But Thomas pointed to the idea of complexity, and this whole system of systems thing is complex. And if we're dealing with something that is complex, then we can't simply design as an engineer with a total understanding of the consequences. So we have to advance by learning and learn while advancing, if we're then dealing with these types of interventions. And so monitoring then becomes important. I mean, this whole idea of, well, I can put something in place and I'm going to get this out of it, and it's so black and white that I know what the investment is going to give, is not a sensible argument to make. So, I mean, I know what the well-being benefits of avoiding going on the tube in London are, for example, because I can now avoid doing that. I've got one of these things. It's a phone, and on the phone I can work out how to go through London walking rather than taking the tube. And so my well-being quotient, I know, is far better if I walk from Euston to Westminster than if I take the tube. So how do you quantify that? Well, it is very difficult so to do, but an understanding of those benefits, and people with that understanding co-designing and co-analyzing, I think, is perhaps the way I would look to proceed.
Thank you. And a quite related question is, how many options, Chris, how many options are needed to map a city's preferences? How many opinions are needed?
So yes, so you want the opinion of everyone in the city. That's fine. So we just talk to everyone in the city. Very, very difficult. What we did with the Foresight Futures Cities project is we went to Birmingham and spoke to those who govern in Birmingham to ask who should be at the table. And they, in fact, issued the invitation. So our cohort of 37 people in that room, all representing different aspects of the city, enabled us to get what we thought was an appropriate balance of top down and bottom up. It is enormously difficult to capture everyone's ideas, but we think we got sufficient buy-in from that to provide the design brief for our changes in cities. Now you could go to, if I was doing this in Leicester, I could go to the city governors and find out what their aspirations are, and they'll be writ large. And we want this city to be presumably the best city in the UK. We want to pollute Birmingham rather than Leicester, as we've heard. We want to make sure that what we've got is this for our citizens. And then if you listen to what the citizens are saying through their elected representatives, we would then have a portfolio of design criteria then to which we should work. And so I think we can get sufficient of a steer on what we should be doing in terms of global priorities, national priorities, local priorities, both bottom up and top down.
Thank you. That was very clarifying. There's another question that can be for both, which is, do you think there's enough joined up thinking within governance between the leveling up agenda, health, and the environment to achieve these goals as much as possible?
Joined
Chris,
up
you go
government.
first on that.
Excuse me?
Yeah,
Chris, go first.
absolutely. So is there enough? I think not. We organize ourselves as academics. We organize ourselves according to disciplines. We reward our performance according to disciplines, because we then have a research excellence framework that looks at to rewarding the narrow and deep rather than the highly cross-disciplinary type activity. We work in practice silos. Industry works also in practice silos. We govern in silos. And what we're now looking, so the whole point of UCRIC is, can we break down those silos? Join-uppedness is the word that I would then look to use. And we can get to that point using and again, I've done research on this, the movement towards transdisciplinarity. So you bring all the disciplines together, but you work beyond those disciplines. And it takes a lot of time and effort to get to that point, but then you get the outcome that you need. And government also, I think, recognizes this. Government is, so I've spoken to a number of chief scientific advisors who will come at this from the point of view of systems, as Paul has just done. So understanding the systems is really important, but understanding all of those elements of the systems then becomes important. And working beyond the silos, I think, is something that it remains an aspiration. It's difficult to do, but I think we have ways of doing it. Paul, I don't know if you agree.
No, I think so. I mean, I don't think I would say the system is perfect or performing particularly well in terms of the governance. You know, let's be honest about that. But I think that with the strange to say, with the invention of DLUP, the idea that there was a government department looking at levelling up, and I think having worked with them, they are trying hard to think about that kind of I won't say a whole systems approach, but I don't think they've got that far yet. But recognizing there are multiple benefits for that, and I think you're right. You know, you have to keep changing the system. It's one of continuous improvement. You know, we might like to think of scientists that we could redesign a system. We could change the local governance structure. We could the way that we could then put the green infrastructure in, et cetera, as it rolls out. But actually, it is that continuous improvement driven by a demand from the public. You've seen it with actually, interestingly, onshore wind this week. In fact, the public are much more in favour of onshore wind, and in a way, then politicians have turned around and said, well, you know, actually maybe we should have it then, you know, because the cheapest way to get to more decarbonised energy. So I think that, do I think there's enough joined up thinking? No. Do I think that we're on the right path? Yes. Do I think that we need to continuously improve and challenge ourselves? Absolutely, on every occasion. And I think, as Chris says, our science system doesn't reward us for that. And I think that by pushing and recognizing that we need to break down our disciplinary boundaries and make sure that we're translating that into policy, I think is important as well.
Thank you so much. I think we don't have time to go through all the questions. So I think on this positive note, is a good moment to finish the Q&A. So I'll hand over to Thomas for final remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nerea. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for the questions, and thank you for the discussions. It's always very, very interesting, and I wish we could go on, because I think this is touching on so many interesting aspects. I think it's coming up to 1:30. So I think all that's left for me now to do is to thank both speakers for very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. Thank the audience for your participation, all your questions. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you, everybody. And just to let you know that the next webinar in the RECLAIM webinar series will be on the 4th of January, where we have two speakers again, Professor John Gallagher from Trinity College Dublin and Dr. Sarah Ward from the Rivers Trust. Again, touching on green-blue infrastructure. So without further ado, so say thank you to everybody. If you want to engage more with the RECLAIM network, here's some link. We have a LinkedIn page. We also have a Twitter account, so we'll see if we can eclipse Paul's attempts to get followers here. And we have a website as well, where you can find more about the opportunities. We do have some funding to support engagement in terms of secondments and workshops and small projects. So if you're interested in connecting more with the project and through the project, please use these resources. Thank you, everybody, and happy Christmas and happy New Year's, and see you all in early January.